So this diagram basically shows the cerebrum, which is the largest and most complex part of the human brain. It is divided into 4 lobes. Frontal, which is green, and it deals with behavior, intelligence, memory, movement. It basically carries out higher mental processes like decision making, thinking, and planning. Then you have the temporal lobe, which is yellow, and it revolves around hearing and selective listening. So it basically receives sensory information like speech and sound from the ears. Then we have the parental lobe, which is orange. And the parental lobe deals with movement, orientation, intelligence, language, and it also gives you perception of stimuli. Then you have the occipital lobe, which is blue, and the occipital lobe is responsible for processing information from the eyes. So it's just visual processing. Then we have the cerebellum, which is balance coordination, so it keeps you upright. And lastly, we have the brainstem, which deals with blood pressure, breathing, heartbeat. And if you get damage to the brainstem, it could be seriously fatal. So this is a diagram showing the 4 lobes that I already went over. We have the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, the parental lobe, and the occipital lobe. And on the back we have parts of the brain. So right in the middle we have the thalamus, and the thalamus basically is the processing center for sensory and motor information. To the right of the thalamus we have the Wernicke's area, and the Wernicke's area is responsible for us to break down written and spoken language. To the right of the thalamus we have the Broca's area, and what that does, it's basically responsible for producing language. On top of the thalamus we have the sensory cortex, and the sensory cortex processes information gathered by our 5 senses, so sight, taste, touch, sound, and smell. On top of the sensory cortex we have the motor cortex, and that is responsible for making the muscles move and work together efficiently. And lastly we have the cerebral cortex, which is involved in thinking, perceiving, producing, and understanding language. Other than that, we have the brainstem, the cerebellum, the occipital lobe, the parental lobe, and the frontal lobe. This is the last diagram, and it is the second part to the diagram that I just showed, and it has the same information: the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, the parental lobe, and the occipital lobe. And on the back we have more parts of the brain. So right here we have the spinal cord, and the spinal cord is responsible for transmitting information between the brain and the rest of the body, and it also handles simple reflexes. On top of that we have the medulla, and what that does, it is responsible for regulating largely unconscious functions such as breathing and circulation. Next we have the reticular formation, and what that does are they're basically groups of fibers that carry stimulation related to sleep and arousal through the brainstem. Next we have the pons, and the pons are super important because they connect the upper and the bottom halves of the brain. So it's basically a message station between several areas of the brain. It helps relay the information from the cortex and the cerebellum. Without the pons, the brain would not be able to function because the message would not be able to be transmitted or passed along. Next we have the pituitary gland, and what that is it's the master gland that regulates other endocrine glands. So it's important in controlling growth and development for the endocrine gland. Next we have the hippocampus, and what that does, it's basically important for learning and processing emotional responses and for the storage of long-term memory. After that, we have the amygdala, which is right here, and that is basically linked to emotions such as fear and aggression. So it detects fear, and then it also controls the way we react to certain stimuli. On top of that, we have the hypothalamus, and what that does, it's basically important. It's the center for controlling emotions, automatic functions, and hormone production. Then we have the corpus callosum, and what that does, it's basically the bridge of fibers passing information between the two cerebral hemispheres. And then lastly, we have the prefrontal cortex. And what that is, it's basically implicated in like different varieties such as behavior, planning, and it also contributes to personality development. And that is all for the brain.